Nick Iuppa, and I'm head of the Iuppa Creative Group. We're a small assortment of writers, game developers, software engineers, and graphic artists who produce instructional and serious games for the military, for the U.S. Fire Service, and for a variety of corporate and industrial clients. My talk is going to be based on a book I've written with Terry Borst called End-to-End Game Development. It basically deals with what you do if you want to start a serious game company, from the very start of the company all the way through to completion of a serious game and planning for the second game in your development effort. This is a two-part presentation. Each part of the presentation will be approximately 10 minutes long. In the first part, we'll talk about the conflict between instructional design and game design and why it's critical to do a good instructional design if you want to have an effective serious game. We'll also talk about the analytical process that's part of the instructional design system. In the second part of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about task analysis. That is the process you follow to define the steps that you have to teach in your serious game. We'll talk about instructional strategies that can make the game stronger. And we'll talk a little bit about the creative process and how to design games that are fun, interesting, and effective. Specifically in this talk, I'd like to focus on the comparison of game design and instructional design. That section, chapters 11 through 16 in the book, cover some very interesting and important information, I think, and it's information that is generally not considered when people talk about building a serious game. So let's get into it right now. There's a conflict, and it's pretty clear, between instructional design and game design. Some studies suggest that lack of instructional design makes serious games less effective than they should be. These studies were used as the basis of a request by the Army Research Institute to look at the quality of serious games with and without instructional design as a background. And they cite one very good reference article that was done that makes that point. Without a good solid instructional design, serious games are weaker than they should be. However, many game designers think that instructional design competes with and detracts from their efforts at game design. And this is a very commonly held belief and is one of the reasons why people don't do instructional design as they produce serious games. And there's a solid reason for this concern. I call it the horrors of instructional design. It begins with the fact that instructional design includes two parts. Many ID departments focus solely on the analysis phase. So when a client comes to them and says, will you design and build a serious game for me, they go off and they do an analysis. And when their clients expect to find a finished training product waiting for them, all they get is a series of lengthy reports. This practice has led to a belief among a lot of clients for serious games and other kinds of learning material that instructional design is time-consuming, costly, and unproductive. If you've heard the expression paralysis by analysis, you know that they're talking about this kind of analysis. And this attitude has carried over to the producers of serious games. But the fact is there are some benefits to instructional design. A good analysis gives you a clear understanding of the need for training as stated in performance problems. Now, the idea of stating training needs as performance problems is just kind of a technique that instructional designers use that allows them to focus very clearly on what it is they have to do. If there's a performance problem, they need to come up with a solution. At the same time, a good analysis gives you a look at the learners, their demographics and their special requirements, who they are, where they're located, and what their instructional needs are. It also focuses on the tasks that have to be performed to solve the training problem. That is, the specific steps to do a better job. And among these steps, you'll find some steps that are more important than others. Some steps you may be able to gloss over, but if you make a mistake in some of these other steps, the process fails completely. And finally, all this analysis leads to an establishment of criteria for successful performance. That is, what are the standards for doing the job better? What is it that you have to do the job better than you're doing it now? So what is instructional design? Well, it's a process then, right, that requires several steps. A needs analysis, where you identify the learning problems and their causes, and then create behavioral objectives to overcome the problems. There's a task analysis, where you identify and describe the details and success criteria of the tasks that make up the objectives. And this is a very detailed list of tasks, believe me. Then there's the actual instructional design process, where you look at the objectives and you find strategies that address the learning problems. Now, to do this, you have to know something about instructional design. You have to be aware of the various kinds of instructional strategies that exist for addressing learning problems. And finally, you establish measurement criteria. That is, you create a system that scores and reports on the player's ability to meet the objectives. And it also offers remediation for poor performance. So here's a flow chart of the entire process. And you can see 4 steps that need to be undertaken before you actually begin the game design. You need to do a needs analysis and a task analysis. You have to do that instructional design, and you have to create this scoring and reporting system. A few years ago, we were asked to go up to Alaska and do a study of some behavioral problems that were identified by the U.S. Fire Service up there. Turns out a lot of young kids in Alaska like to play with fire. So much so that they even have gone so far as to burn down whole cities in the process. That's a big problem. So they asked us to go up to Alaska in February and conduct this analysis. And of course, the first thing we did was simplify the steps in the process. So we did the needs analysis and the task analysis together. We did the instructional design and the creation of the measurement systems in one step. And then we had the 2 steps that had to be performed before we could start the creative game design. Here's a look at the analytical process that makes up instructional design. As we said, you start with an initial problem statement, and that problem statement is probably created by your client, somebody who seems to know the subject very well. The point is, you take that problem statement and then you go out into the field and you look for evidence that that problem is correct. Is that really what's causing the performance problem? And then you interpret it, you look at causes, and then you create your objectives. Now here's a detail of that process, because there's a kind of a trick here. When you look at the causes of performance problems, you see there are 3 major kinds. Environmental problems mean that something is stopping people from doing the job right. Motivational problems mean that the people doing the job don't want to do it. And then there's skill knowledge problems. That means they don't know how to. Now the fact is, a serious game, a training project, will only address skill knowledge problems. So if there's something stopping people from performing the job correctly, all the skill and knowledge in the world won't let them do it. Same goes for the fact if they don't want to do the job. And we found a good example of this in a project we did for firefighter safety. When we analyzed some of the critical behaviors of incident commanders in a firefight, we found that one of the problems was they would bring people to the firefighters who were in poor health or weren't in very good physical condition. Basically, the solution to having a firefighter who wasn't able to attend a fire was to send them home for the day and then to call in an able-bodied firefighter. If you send a firefighter home for the day because they're sick or disabled, they lose that day of acquiring benefits. So they were sort of required to go to these fires, even though it was operating against the best interests of certainly the victims of the fire and the firefighters themselves. So we pointed this out and recommended that there be some adjustments to the requirements for firefighters. We were just another voice added to the chorus, of course. But the point is, we were saying that you can tell people not to bring unhealthy firefighters out to a fire, but if there are motivational reasons why they feel they have to do it, all that training isn't going to do the job. You need to change the requirements that are forcing them to do it. So when you go through these causes and boil it down to the skill knowledge problems, then you're able to write your learning objectives. But it's not a bad idea to make these other recommendations at the same time. And believe me, this gives credibility to your organization. If you're brought in to design a serious game to train firefighters and you uncover these kinds of problems, you should be the ones to point them out to the client. Again, going back to our overview of the analytical process, we said you look at the target population for evidence that the people that you're suggesting that your serious game is going to are the people who will benefit from it. You also look at their learning preferences, and while you're out there in the field, you look at what kind of equipment's available. If you're going to train firefighters and you hope that they'll be taking this training in their, in the firehouses where they spend an awful lot of time, and there's no computers available or there's no Xboxes or kinds of games, it affects you know, the kind of game you're able to design to address the learning problem. Finally, when you gather all this data, you present your conclusions and you talk about the project scope, and then you recommend the benefits and payoffs. Now let's look at the business of project scope. I'm sure you can't read this, but this is a set of objectives that we created for the Alaska Kids game that we did. The purpose of the game was to teach young children in Alaska not to play with fire, because in fact there was a lot of dangerous fires being started by children in Alaska. They were burning whole cities down. So here is the list of objectives that we found as a result of our analysis. But you know, that's an awfully big list of objectives. So we started to look at areas that we could reduce. So we scaled down the overall list of objectives, and what you might notice here is that the black type suggests things that we suggested that they remove from the goals. And then we came up with a minimum scope for the project. And we said, if you can do just this, you'll have a very effective game. An interesting side effect of this activity was that basically we identified the contents of a second game. And later on in the book, End-to-End Game Development, we talk about trying to identify the second project you're going to do. Well, if way back at the beginning you figured out that you had too much content for one game, but you could cover the content very well in 2 games, you know, you have a pretty effective argument for a second game. Here's a quick summary of part 1. There's a conflict between instructional design and game design. Instructional design is seen by many game designers, and in fact by many people in industry, as time-consuming, costly, and unproductive. Nevertheless, game design suffers without a good instructional design. Again, this is Nick Iupa. I hope you've enjoyed the first part of the presentation. As I've said, it's based on the book that Terry Borst and I have written called End-to-End Game Development. Thanks for watching.